If signing these papers is supposed to save my family, then why does everyone look afraid of the truth? Charlotte Bennet barely recognized her own voice as the words escaped through trembling lips. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the luxurious hospital suite, each gentle beep sounding less like reassurance and more like a countdown towards something no one wanted to explain. Every magazine she had ever appeared in described her life as a modern fairy tale. Married to one of Chicago's youngest self-made millionaires, living in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, expecting their first child after years of hoping, she had become the woman strangers admired and secretly envied. They believed wealth erased fear. They believed expensive hospitals guaranteed safety. They believed beautiful lives could never hide terrifying secrets. They were wrong. Charlotte lay quietly on the hospital bed with one hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting golden reflections across polished marble floors and fresh white orchids arranged beside the bed. Everything inside the room whispered comfort. Yet every instinct inside her whispered danger. Preston Whitmore stood near the foot of the bed wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that looked untouched by the sleepless night. His polished shoes reflected the morning light. His expensive watch caught every passing ray of sunshine. Anyone walking by the open doorway would have seen the picture of a devoted husband standing faithfully beside his pregnant wife. Charlotte knew better. Over the past several weeks, his smile had become rehearsed, his kindness carefully timed, and every reassuring sentence somehow ended with another request for her signature. Isabella Cole leaned elegantly against the wall, dressed in a striking red designer dress that looked more appropriate for an evening gala than a maternity ward. She offered Charlotte a graceful smile that never reached her eyes. It was the smile of someone completely certain the story would end exactly the way she expected. Charlotte could not explain why that frightened her more than anything else. Preston picked up a leather folder resting on the bedside table and placed it gently across the blanket. He uncapped a silver pen and slid it toward her with practiced patience. "One signature," he said quietly. "Everything becomes easier after that." Charlotte looked down at the paperwork without touching it. She had already noticed something impossible. The first set of documents she reviewed shortly after arriving at the hospital was not identical to the one now resting in front of her. A paragraph had disappeared. Another page carried different legal wording. The hospital logo looked identical. The paper felt identical, but the meaning had changed. Someone had replaced the documents overnight. The question was not who. The question was why. Charlotte slowly pushed the pen away. "I want Dr. Reynolds to explain every page first." Preston's calm expression barely changed, but the silence that followed felt unusually heavy. Isabella stepped closer, folding her arms with effortless confidence. "You are overthinking this," she said softly. "Hospitals update paperwork all the time." Charlotte looked directly into her eyes. "Then why does everyone avoid answering my questions?" Neither of them replied. Instead, Preston reached toward the folder again, carefully opening it to the final page where a single blank signature line waited beneath several paragraphs of legal language. He never pointed to the earlier pages, only the signature. Charlotte's heartbeat quickened. Across the room, the heart monitor answered with a slightly faster rhythm. Somewhere beyond the closed hospital door, an elevator bell echoed through the quiet hallway. Moments later came the sound of measured footsteps approaching the maternity floor. Preston heard them too. His eyes lifted toward the doorway for only a second before returning to Charlotte. For the first time since she had entered the hospital, confidence slipped from his face. Whoever had just stepped off that elevator already knew something hidden inside those papers, and Charlotte suddenly realized the signature everyone wanted was never the real secret. 24 hours earlier, Charlotte Bennet still believed the future could be planned with enough love, patience, and faith. She woke inside the penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan to the gentle glow of early morning sunlight stretching across polished hardwood floors. The nursery down the hall was almost finished. A white rocking chair waited beside the window. Tiny blankets had already been folded inside the dresser. Every detail reflected the dream she and Preston Whitmore had spent years building together. At least that was the story everyone else believed. The first hint that something had changed arrived before breakfast. Preston's phone vibrated across the kitchen island. He glanced at the screen and immediately turned it face down. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but Charlotte noticed because he had never hidden anything from her before. "Business?" she asked with an easy smile. Preston nodded without looking up. "An overseas client. They never seem to care what time it is here." His answer sounded perfectly reasonable. Yet instead of returning the phone to his pocket, he carried it into another room before answering. Charlotte stood quietly beside the coffee maker, listening to the distant murmur of his voice. She could not make out the words, only the strange urgency behind them. When he returned a few minutes later, he smiled exactly as he always had, but something felt different. His smile reached his mouth. It no longer reached his eyes. Later that afternoon, they attended a charity event at one of Chicago's leading children's hospitals. Reporters gathered around Preston, praising his latest donation, while photographers asked Charlotte to stand beside him with one hand resting gently over her growing baby bump. The flashes captured the perfect family. What none of the cameras captured was the moment Charlotte turned and saw Isabella Cole already standing beside Preston before the interviews had even ended. Isabella was introduced as the foundation's new public relations consultant, elegant, confident, and effortlessly charming. She greeted Charlotte warmly, complimented the nursery photos that had recently appeared in a magazine feature, and somehow knew details Charlotte had never shared publicly. "The lake view from your nursery must be beautiful at sunrise," Isabella said casually. Charlotte smiled politely, but the comment lingered in her thoughts. Only close family members had ever seen that room. Driving home through downtown traffic, Charlotte tried convincing herself that she was imagining problems where none existed. Pregnancy made emotion stronger. Every parenting article said so. Still, another detail refused to disappear from her mind. During the event, Isabella had answered a question directed at Preston before he even opened his mouth. They exchanged brief glances that felt practiced, almost automatic, as though they had worked together much longer than anyone admitted. That evening, Charlotte received a routine call from Dr. Reynolds. Her latest prenatal readings suggested elevated blood pressure, and he recommended a precautionary overnight observation if the mild symptoms continued. Before Charlotte could respond, Preston immediately volunteered to arrange admission at Chicago's most exclusive private hospital. "You deserve the best care available," he insisted. His concern sounded sincere enough to erase most of her lingering doubts. He packed her overnight bag himself, reminded her to bring the baby's ultrasound photos, and even canceled 2 business meetings without hesitation. Watching him move carefully through their bedroom, Charlotte almost felt guilty for questioning him at all. Then she noticed one final detail. As Preston zipped the travel bag closed, another leather folder rested quietly on his desk. Across the front was a small gold-embossed label she had never seen before. Before she could ask about it, he calmly picked it up, slipped it into his briefcase, and smiled. "Ready?" he asked. Charlotte nodded and followed him toward the elevator, never realizing that the folder he carried would soon become the one thing standing between her family's future and a truth no amount of wealth could keep hidden. The private maternity wing welcomed every patient with quiet elegance. Soft piano music drifted through the lobby, fresh white orchids lined the reception desk, and the scent of clean linen filled the air. Charlotte Bennett wanted to believe she had arrived at the safest place in Chicago. Dr. Ethan Reynolds greeted her with a reassuring smile before reviewing her latest prenatal readings. "Everything looks encouraging," he said calmly. "Your blood pressure is a little higher than I would like, but your daughter appears healthy. I recommend observation overnight simply to be cautious." Charlotte nodded with relief. Preston Whitmore thanked the physician, squeezed her hand gently, and even joked that she would be back home before the nursery wallpaper was finished drying. Everyone laughed. For a brief moment, the uneasy feeling that had followed Charlotte all day finally began to fade. A nurse escorted her into an executive maternity suite overlooking the city skyline. The room looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. Fresh flowers rested beside the bed. Comfortable leather chairs surrounded a small sitting area. Afternoon sunlight poured through tall windows, casting warm reflections across polished floors. Charlotte settled onto the bed while Preston unpacked her overnight bag with surprising care. He placed the framed ultrasound photograph on the bedside table, arranged her favorite blanket, and asked if she wanted herbal tea from the patient lounge. It looked exactly like the thoughtful husband everyone admired. Yet the strange leather folder never left his briefcase. After completing the admission process, A young nurse named Emma Lawson entered carrying a clipboard. "These are your routine admission forms," she explained pleasantly. Charlotte carefully reviewed every page before signing the standard medical consent forms. Everything appeared ordinary. Insurance information, emergency contacts, treatment authorization. Nothing unusual. Emma collected the paperwork with a smile and quietly left the room. An hour later, another hospital employee arrived carrying what appeared to be an identical folder. "I am sorry," the woman said politely. "There were a few updated pages that need your signature." Charlotte accepted the documents without concern until her eyes paused on the second page. The formatting looked almost identical to the forms she had already completed, but one paragraph describing routine patient consent had disappeared. In its place appeared unfamiliar legal language referencing temporary financial authority connected to future family assets. Charlotte frowned. "I thought I already signed everything." The employee glanced at the papers with visible confusion. "These were waiting for me at the administrative desk," she replied. "If you have questions, I can ask someone from patient services to explain them." Charlotte smiled politely and closed the folder. "I would rather wait for Dr. Reynolds." The employee apologized and carried the documents away without argument. Several minutes later, Preston returned from what he described as an important business call. His first question surprised her. "Did anyone bring the updated paperwork?" Charlotte studied his expression carefully. "Yes. I decided not to sign until Dr. Reynolds reviews it." His smile remained perfectly composed, but a flicker of disappointment crossed his face before disappearing almost instantly. "That is your choice," he answered. "I simply want everything ready before the baby arrives." Charlotte nodded, although something inside her refused to settle. As evening approached, Isabella Cole unexpectedly appeared outside the open doorway carrying an elegant bouquet of white lilies. "I heard you were here for observation," she said warmly. "I wanted to wish you both the best." Charlotte thanked her, but another question quietly formed in her mind. She had never told Isabella which hospital she would be using. Neither had Preston. Before Charlotte could ask how she knew where to find them, Isabella casually placed the flowers beside the ultrasound picture and glanced toward Preston. It lasted less than a second, just a silent exchange of understanding between two people who seemed to know far more than they were willing to admit. Across the room, Charlotte noticed Preston's leather briefcase sitting partially open on the chair. Inside, she caught another glimpse of the same gold-embossed folder. This time, however, a different stack of documents rested beneath it. Someone was changing the paperwork more than once, and Charlotte suddenly realized the hospital stay itself might never have been the real reason she had been brought there. Charlotte Bennett barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the altered paperwork returned to her mind with unsettling clarity. The room remained peaceful, almost impossibly so. Soft lighting glowed beneath the cabinets. The city skyline shimmered beyond the windows, and the quiet hum of medical equipment created the illusion that nothing could possibly go wrong inside such an elegant hospital. Yet Charlotte had stopped trusting appearances. Shortly after sunrise, Dr. Ethan Reynolds entered with his usual calm professionalism. He carefully reviewed the overnight monitoring results before smiling reassuringly. "Your daughter is doing very well," he said. "The elevated blood pressure has improved. I would still like to observe you for a few more hours before making a decision about discharge." Charlotte thanked him sincerely. She almost asked about the mysterious paperwork, but decided to wait until Preston stepped out of the room. The opportunity never came. Within minutes of the doctor's departure, Preston Whitmore returned carrying the familiar leather briefcase. He closed the door quietly behind him before placing the folder on the small table beside Charlotte's bed. "Dr. Reynolds believes everything is stable," he said pleasantly. "That means we can finally finish the administrative paperwork." Charlotte looked directly at him. "The paperwork keeps changing." Preston remained composed. "Minor revisions happen all the time. Medical forms do not suddenly include financial language overnight." The words hung in the air between them. Preston slowly opened the folder and turned directly to the final page. Once again, he ignored every previous section. His finger rested only beside the blank signature line. "Sign here," he said evenly. "Everything else has already been reviewed." Charlotte gently pushed the folder away. "I will wait until Dr. Reynolds explains every page himself." A quiet knock interrupted the conversation before either of them spoke again. Isabella Cole entered carrying a fresh arrangement of white flowers and a warm smile that seemed carefully practiced. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said gracefully. Preston stepped aside without answering. Isabella placed the flowers near the window before turning toward Charlotte. "You have had a stressful night," she said softly. "Sometimes trusting the people around you is easier than questioning every detail." Charlotte met her gaze without hesitation. "Trust is earned by honesty." Isabella's smile faded for only a heartbeat before returning exactly as polished as before. "You have always been very cautious." "No," Charlotte replied quietly. "Only recently." The room became unusually still. Outside, families laughed softly in the hallway as visitors arrived with balloons and flowers for newborn babies. Their voices reminded Charlotte that life beyond room 1208 continued as normal, completely unaware that something deeply unsettling was unfolding behind one closed door. Preston carefully closed the folder again before speaking with surprising patience. "Charlotte, this delay serves no purpose." "Then explain the changes." "They are legal updates." "Prepared by whom?" He did not answer. Instead, he glanced toward Isabella. The brief exchange between them lasted less than a second, yet it confirmed everything Charlotte had been quietly fearing since the previous afternoon. They were communicating without words. Whatever explanation existed had already been rehearsed. Charlotte instinctively rested one hand over her baby bump as a gentle movement reminded her exactly why she could not ignore her instincts. A nurse approached the doorway carrying fresh linens, but paused after noticing the tense silence inside the room. Preston immediately smiled and thanked her, explaining that they were discussing routine family paperwork. The nurse accepted the explanation and continued down the hallway. Charlotte watched the door close again. It suddenly occurred to her how easy it was for ordinary moments to hide extraordinary secrets. Preston picked up the silver pen once more and placed it carefully beside the folder. "This is the last document we need today," he said. Charlotte looked at the untouched pen before slowly shaking her head. "Then it can wait." At that exact moment, somewhere beyond the maternity floor, an elevator chimed softly, followed by the measured sound of footsteps approaching with quiet confidence. And for reasons she could not explain, Charlotte sensed that someone else had finally begun asking the same question she refused to stop asking. The soft chime of the elevator lingered in Charlotte Bennett's mind long after the footsteps faded somewhere beyond the maternity wing. She could not see who had arrived, yet something inside her quietly refused to dismiss the sound as coincidence. Preston Whitmore gathered the unsigned documents with measured patience, slipped them back into the familiar leather folder, and placed it carefully inside his briefcase. His movements remained calm, almost rehearsed. That calmness unsettled Charlotte more than raised voices ever could. People who believed everything was under control rarely showed urgency. Isabella Cole adjusted the fresh flowers near the window before glancing toward the hallway. For the first time since entering the room, the confidence on her face appeared slightly strained. It lasted only a moment before her polished smile returned. "Perhaps everyone simply needs a little time," she said pleasantly. Charlotte offered no reply. She had stopped listening to reassuring words. Instead, she watched details. Every glance, every pause, every silence. Minutes later, a young nurse entered carrying a fresh pitcher of water and a clipboard. Her identification badge read Emma Lawson. She greeted Charlotte warmly, checked the fetal monitor, and smiled with visible relief as the baby's heartbeat continued at a healthy rhythm. "Everything looks wonderful," Emma said. "Your little girl seems very comfortable." Charlotte thanked her before lowering her voice. "May I ask you something?" Emma nodded. Charlotte glanced briefly toward Preston and Isabella before speaking carefully. "Have my admission documents been replaced since yesterday?" The question caught Emma completely off guard. She looked down at the chart in her hands before quietly answering. "I only have access to the medical records assigned to my shift, but I can certainly ask patient administration if something appears unusual." Before Charlotte could respond, Preston stepped forward with effortless politeness. "There is no need to trouble anyone," he said with an easy smile. "Everything has already been explained." Emma looked from Preston to Charlotte, sensing that the room had grown noticeably quieter. "If Mrs. Whitmore has questions," she replied gently, "she is absolutely entitled to receive clear answers." Charlotte noticed the smallest flicker of surprise cross Preston's face before disappearing. Emma finished checking the monitors, wished them a peaceful morning, and quietly left the suite. As the door closed, Charlotte heard Isabella release a slow breath. "She asks too many questions," Isabella murmured. Preston remained silent. Instead, he reached for his phone and stepped into the hallway. Charlotte watched through the partially opened door as he spoke briefly with someone she could not see before returning only seconds later. Nothing about the conversation looked casual. Nearly 30 minutes passed before Emma returned alone. This time she carried only a folded patient information brochure. As she adjusted the bedside table, she carefully slid the brochure beneath Charlotte's hand without attracting attention. "You asked earlier about your paperwork," Emma said in a perfectly ordinary tone. "Inside the brochure you will find contact information if you ever need additional assistance." Charlotte nodded politely. After Emma left once again, Charlotte waited until Preston answered another incoming phone call near the window. She quietly opened the brochure. A single handwritten sentence appeared on the otherwise blank inside cover. "If you believe someone is preventing you from making your own decisions, tell me only one name." "Your father." Charlotte stared at the words as her heartbeat quietly accelerated. She suddenly remembered a conversation from the previous afternoon while Preston had been parking the car. Emma had helped settle her into the room, and Charlotte had nervously laughed before saying, "If anything ever feels wrong, my father will know exactly what to do." Emma had remembered every word. Charlotte carefully folded the brochure and slipped it beneath her blanket just as Preston turned back toward the bed. He noticed nothing. Outside the room, somewhere beyond the quiet hallway, another elevator bell echoed across the maternity floor. This time the footsteps that followed sounded slower, steadier, and filled with the quiet confidence of someone who was no longer searching for answers, but already carrying them. Charlotte Bennett folded the small brochure beneath the blanket just as Preston Whitmore slipped his phone back into his pocket. His expression remained calm, yet she noticed how often his attention drifted toward the hallway instead of the window overlooking the city. It was as though he was waiting for someone to arrive before time quietly ran out. Charlotte rested both hands over her 7-month pregnancy as another gentle movement reminded her that every decision now affected more than herself. The fetal monitor continued its steady rhythm while another screen displayed occasional mild contractions. They were not dangerous, according to Dr. Ethan Reynolds, but they were becoming slightly more frequent than they had been earlier that morning. A few minutes later, Dr. Reynolds returned with another reassuring smile. He reviewed the monitor carefully before looking directly at Charlotte. "Your daughter continues to do very well," he explained. "The contractions are still mild, but I would like to keep you under observation for a little longer. We simply want to be cautious." Charlotte thanked him, relieved by the doctor's confidence. As he prepared to leave, Preston politely asked whether they could have a few minutes alone to discuss family matters. Dr. Reynolds glanced at Charlotte, who offered a hesitant nod, then quietly stepped into the hallway. The moment the door closed, Preston carried the familiar leather folder back to the bedside table. He opened it with deliberate care and placed the silver pen beside the final page. "We have delayed this long enough," he said evenly. "Everything will become much simpler once you sign." Charlotte looked at the document without touching it, then explained why every version is different. Preston remained silent for a moment before answering. "The changes are administrative. Administrative paperwork does not suddenly mention financial authority connected to our daughter." Isabella Cole entered quietly before Preston could respond. She carried another sealed envelope and handed it to him without a word. Preston removed several additional pages and placed them beneath the original documents. Charlotte immediately noticed that none of the new pages carried Dr. Reynolds' signature or the hospital's standard patient authorization format. Instead, they referenced legal trustees, temporary authority, and future family assets. Charlotte slowly raised her eyes toward Preston. Why would maternity paperwork discuss inheritance? Isabella attempted a reassuring smile. Large families often prepare legal documents before a child arrives. Charlotte answered calmly. Then they usually do it with their attorney, not inside a hospital room. Once again, neither of them offered a direct explanation. The fetal monitor released a slightly sharper tone as another mild contraction appeared across the screen. Charlotte instinctively followed the breathing exercises she had learned during childbirth classes, focusing on slow, measured breaths while protecting her growing baby bump with one hand. Preston glanced briefly toward the monitor before lowering his voice. Every delay increases unnecessary complications. Charlotte met his eyes without hesitation. For whom? The question lingered unanswered. Outside the room, nurses continued moving through the maternity floor while distant conversations blended with the soft hum of hospital equipment. Then another familiar sound echoed down the hallway. An elevator bell chimed. A few seconds later came steady footsteps. They were slow, confident, and completely unhurried. Whoever was approaching did not sound lost or uncertain. They sounded like someone who already knew exactly where they were going. Preston's attention shifted immediately toward the closed door. Isabella stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Charlotte watched both of them carefully. For the first time since entering the hospital, neither appeared confident. The footsteps grew closer with each passing second until they finally stopped just outside the suite. A quiet knock followed. No one moved. Charlotte felt hope quietly replace fear as another gentle movement from her daughter reminded her to remain calm. Then the door handle slowly began to turn, and without seeing who stood outside, Charlotte somehow knew that the questions everyone had tried so hard to avoid were finally about to receive their answers. The door opened slowly, and William Bennett stepped into the executive maternity suite without a single wasted movement. At 63, his silver hair, tailored charcoal overcoat, and calm posture carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent a lifetime solving difficult problems without raising his voice. His eyes found Charlotte Bennett first. The fear that had been building inside her since arriving at the hospital finally began to dissolve. She whispered only one word. "Dad." William offered a reassuring smile before turning toward Preston Whitmore and Isabella Cole. Neither of them spoke. For the first time that morning, they appeared genuinely uncertain. Preston forced a polite expression and stepped forward with an outstretched hand. "William, this is an unexpected surprise." William ignored the gesture completely. Instead, he calmly placed a slim leather portfolio on the table beside the unsigned paperwork. "I came because my daughter asked questions that nobody seemed interested in answering," he replied evenly. His voice remained controlled, but every word carried unmistakable confidence. Dr. Ethan Reynolds returned moments later, stopping just inside the doorway after noticing several unfamiliar faces gathering outside the room. Behind William stood the hospital's chief executive officer, the director of patient compliance, the hospital's legal counsel, and 2 security supervisors. None of them appeared alarmed. They appeared prepared. Charlotte watched Preston's confident posture begin to change for the first time since the previous afternoon. Isabella quietly folded her arms, although the composure she had displayed throughout the day seemed noticeably strained. William turned toward the chief executive officer and gently slid the leather portfolio across the table. "Everything you need is inside," he said. The chief executive officer opened the portfolio and removed several neatly organized folders along with a tablet computer. Within moments, the large wall display normally used for medical imaging illuminated with security footage from the maternity floor. The first recording showed the hallway outside Charlotte's room earlier that morning. Preston entered carrying one set of documents. A short time later, another employee arrived with different paperwork. Minutes after that, Isabella appeared. The timestamps established a clear sequence. Another file displayed electronic access records from the hospital information system. Multiple revisions had been made to Charlotte's admission packet within less than 18 hours. Dr. Reynolds leaned closer to the screen. "I did not authorize any of these document revisions," he said quietly. The director of patient compliance nodded. "Neither did our department." The chief executive officer selected another file. Side-by-side comparisons appeared on the screen, highlighting every difference between the original admission documents and the later versions. Entire paragraphs concerning routine patient care had been replaced by legal language involving temporary authority over future financial matters connected to Charlotte's unborn child. Silence settled across the room. Preston finally spoke. "There must be an administrative misunderstanding." William looked directly at him. "Administrative misunderstandings do not rewrite legal language 3 different times." Emma Lawson quietly entered after being invited by the compliance director. She appeared nervous but determined. Mrs. Bennett asked why her paperwork kept changing, she explained. "When nobody could answer, I followed hospital policy and submitted a confidential ethics report." The chief executive officer thanked her before turning back toward the display. That report automatically initiated an internal review before Mr. Bennett even arrived at the hospital. Charlotte slowly realized the elevator she had heard earlier had never brought only her father. It had brought the beginning of the truth. William stepped beside her bed and gently placed one hand over hers. "You trusted your instincts," he said softly. "That decision protected more than you realized." Charlotte glanced toward the untouched silver pin resting beside the unsigned paperwork. Only hours earlier it had represented pressure, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. Now it represented something entirely different. It was the one signature that never happened, and because it never happened, every hidden detail had finally come into the light where it could no longer remain concealed. The executive maternity suite remained remarkably quiet after the final comparison appeared on the display. No one hurried to speak because the evidence had already done what arguments never could. Charlotte Bennett watched the changing expressions around the room with a calm she had not felt since arriving at the hospital. The uncertainty that had followed her through the previous 24 hours slowly gave way to clarity. She had trusted her instincts when every reassuring smile encouraged her to ignore them, and that single decision had changed everything. The chief executive officer carefully reviewed one document after another before setting them aside. "Our preliminary review confirms that these legal pages are not part of the hospital's approved maternity admission process," he said. "They were introduced after the original medical packet had already been completed." Dr. Ethan Reynolds examined the highlighted revisions once more before quietly shaking his head. "None of these changes came through my office," he said. "If Mrs. Bennett had signed them believing they were routine medical forms, she would never have received the explanation every patient deserves." The director of patient compliance nodded in agreement while opening another report. Electronic audit logs showed every revision, every account used to access the records, and the exact times each version had been created. Temporary credentials had been activated, used briefly, and then removed from the system. Instead of hiding the activity, the pattern had preserved it. William Bennett folded his hands and looked toward Preston Whitmore. "Technology has a remarkable memory," he said evenly, "especially when people believe no one is paying attention." Preston attempted to remain composed. "I never instructed anyone to alter hospital records." The hospital's legal counsel responded calmly. "That determination will be made through the appropriate review process. Our responsibility today is preserving every document exactly as it exists." Isabella Cole, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke in a measured voice. "Surely there has been some misunderstanding." William looked toward her with the same steady expression he had maintained since entering the room. Misunderstandings become much easier to recognize when every version of a document is placed side by side. Emma Lawson stepped forward after being invited by the compliance director. Though visibly nervous, her voice remained steady. When Mrs. Bennett asked why the paperwork kept changing, no one could provide a clear answer. "Hospital policy requires us to report unexplained alterations involving patient documentation, so I followed that procedure." The chief executive officer thanked her before announcing that the ethics report had triggered an immediate internal investigation, preserving electronic records before any additional changes could occur. Charlotte listened quietly as the conversation shifted from suspicion to documented facts. She realized that no dramatic confrontation had been necessary. The truth had emerged because one nurse chose integrity over convenience, one physician insisted on proper procedure, and one father arrived prepared with patience instead of anger. The silver pin still rested beside the unsigned documents exactly where Preston had placed it earlier. It now seemed strangely insignificant. Only hours before it had represented pressure and uncertainty. Now it represented restraint. Because Charlotte had refused to sign before understanding what she was reading, every unanswered question remained available for careful examination instead of becoming an irreversible mistake. William turned toward his daughter with a reassuring smile. "You protected yourself by asking for an explanation," he said softly. "Never apologize for wanting to understand what someone asks you to sign." Charlotte felt another gentle movement from her unborn daughter and rested both hands across her baby bump. Outside the large windows, afternoon sunlight reflected across the Chicago skyline with quiet brilliance. Inside the room, the atmosphere had changed completely. Fear no longer controlled the conversation. Transparency did. As hospital administrators collected the disputed paperwork for formal review and prepared the next steps under established procedures, Charlotte understood that real security had never come from wealth, elegant surroundings, or impressive promises. It came from the courage to pause, ask one more question, and refuse to surrender her judgment simply because someone else insisted there was no time left. 3 months later, spring sunlight filled the same private hospital where Charlotte Bennett had once questioned every document placed before her. The atmosphere felt completely different now. Fresh flowers lined the maternity wing, newborn families smiled in quiet celebration, and the gentle sounds of laughter replaced the uncertainty that had once surrounded room 1208. Charlotte stood near the large window holding her healthy baby daughter against her shoulder. The little girl slept peacefully, completely unaware that her first weeks of life had already taught the adults around her lessons they would never forget. Charlotte smiled as she watched tiny fingers wrap around her own. She realized that the greatest feeling in the world was not relief alone. It was the quiet confidence that came from knowing she had protected her child simply by refusing to ignore her instincts. William Bennett stood a few feet away with his hands folded comfortably in front of him. He admired his granddaughter with the gentle pride that only a parent could fully understand. Charlotte looked toward him and laughed softly. She already knows exactly how to get everyone's attention. William smiled. She learned that from her mother. For the first time in months, Charlotte laughed without forcing herself to sound cheerful. The fear that had once followed every conversation had finally disappeared. During the weeks after the hospital investigation, administrators completed a comprehensive review of the altered documentation. New verification procedures were introduced throughout the maternity department. Independent approval became mandatory for every non-medical document presented to patients, and additional safeguards ensured that electronic revisions would require multiple levels of authorization before becoming active. Dr. Ethan Reynolds later explained that the review strengthened the hospital's commitment to patient transparency and reinforced the importance of encouraging questions instead of discouraging them. Emma Lawson received formal recognition from hospital leadership for following ethical reporting procedures exactly as she had been trained. She accepted the honor with quiet humility, insisting that protecting patients was simply part of being a nurse. William privately established a scholarship in Emma's name for future nursing students who demonstrated exceptional commitment to patient advocacy. He never organized a public ceremony because he believed genuine gratitude did not require an audience. Preston Whitmore gradually disappeared from the business headlines that had once celebrated every corporate success. Several organizations quietly announced leadership changes while independent legal and administrative reviews continued examining the disputed paperwork through the proper channels. Isabella Cole also withdrew from public attention as the events surrounding the investigation became impossible to ignore. Charlotte chose not to follow every development. She had spent enough time allowing fear and uncertainty to occupy her thoughts. Instead, she devoted each morning to rocking her daughter beside the nursery window overlooking Lake Michigan, reading children's stories aloud, and building the peaceful home she had almost lost without ever realizing it. One afternoon, she returned to the hospital carrying a bouquet of white lilies for the maternity staff. As she walked past the familiar hallway, she paused briefly outside the room where everything had changed. Another young family now occupied the suite. Soft laughter drifted through the partially open door while grandparents admired a newborn sleeping peacefully beside the window. Charlotte smiled quietly before continuing toward the elevator where William waited patiently. Neither of them needed to revisit the past. The future had already answered every important question. As the elevator doors opened and warm spring air welcomed them outside, Charlotte looked down at her daughter and understood the greatest inheritance a parent could ever leave behind. It was never measured by wealth, elegant homes, impressive titles, or carefully prepared documents. It was measured by the courage to seek the truth, the wisdom to trust honest instincts, and the quiet strength to protect one's dignity even when every comfortable appearance suggested there was nothing left to question. Those were the gifts her daughter would carry for the rest of her life, and no signature could ever place a price upon them.